At my daughter's engagement, the groom raised a toast. She whispered, "Dad, call 911 right now." Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from, so tell me your country or city in the comments below. If you enjoy emotional stories filled with mystery, family drama, and unforgettable twists, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and become part of our growing community so you never miss another story. Now let me tell you about the night that changed my life forever. My name is Daniel Carter, and for most of my life, I believed I understood the people closest to me. I worked hard, protected my family, and dreamed of the day I would proudly walk my only daughter down the aisle. When she announced her engagement to a charming young businessman named Ethan, I thanked God for blessing her with what appeared to be a kind and successful man. Everyone admired him. He was polite, confident, generous, and always knew exactly what to say. Friends told me I was lucky to have such a future son-in-law, and even though something deep inside me occasionally felt uneasy, I dismissed it as the natural worry of an overprotective father. The engagement celebration was held in a beautiful lakeside banquet hall filled with warm lights, elegant flowers, and the laughter of relatives who had traveled from across the country to celebrate with us. My daughter Emma looked happier than I had ever seen her, and watching her smile made every sacrifice I had made throughout my life feel worthwhile. As I stood among our guests raising my glass, I had no idea that within minutes everything would change. A single whispered sentence from Emma would turn our joyful celebration into the most terrifying night of my life and force me to uncover a truth that no father should ever have to face. Smiled as the guests applauded, believing the hardest part of the evening was already behind us. Emma and Ethan stood together beneath a canopy of white flowers, while cameras flashed from every direction. My wife leaned against my shoulder and whispered that our little girl had never looked so beautiful, and I nodded because I couldn't find the words to describe how proud I felt. The musicians began playing a soft melody as waiters carried trays of sparkling drinks around the hall. Family members shared stories. Children laughed as they chased each other across the dance floor, and every corner of the room seemed filled with happiness. Ethan thanked everyone for attending before lifting his glass to make a toast. He spoke confidently about love, loyalty, and building a future together, and the guests listened with admiration. While everyone focused on him, I noticed Emma's smile slowly disappear. At first, I assumed she was overwhelmed with emotion, but then I saw her glance toward the main entrance several times as though she expected someone to walk in. Her hands trembled ever so slightly, and she tightened her grip on the glass she was holding. When the applause ended, she excused herself and walked toward me with calm, measured steps that hid the fear growing inside her. As soon as she reached my side, she gently hugged me so no one would suspect anything was wrong. With her face close to my ear, she whispered words that instantly drained the color from my face. "Dad, call 911 right now. Please don't ask questions." For a heartbeat, I couldn't move. I wanted to ask what had happened, but the urgency in her voice stopped me. I quietly slipped my phone from my pocket while pretending to smile at our guests. Before I could dial, Emma squeezed my arm and looked directly into my eyes. I had never seen that expression before. She wasn't frightened for herself alone. She looked terrified that everyone in the room was in danger. I glanced toward Ethan, who was laughing with relatives as though nothing was wrong. Yet something about his expression had changed. The warmth I had always seen in his face had vanished, replaced by a cold, watchful look that lasted only a second before he smiled again. In that instant, I realized my daughter's whisper wasn't born from panic. It was a warning, and whatever she had discovered moments before the toast had the power to destroy the happiest day of our family's life. My fingers hovered over the screen of my phone as my heart pounded so loudly. I could barely hear the music still playing around us. I trusted Emma more than anyone in the world, so if she believed we needed help, I wasn't going to ignore her. Trying not to attract attention, I stepped away from the crowd and quietly dialed 911, speaking in a calm voice as I explained that my daughter had urgently asked me to call from her engagement party because she believed something was terribly wrong. The operator assured me that officers would be sent to the venue immediately and instructed me to remain calm, avoid creating panic, and stay where I could observe what was happening. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and returned to the reception area as though nothing had happened. Emma had already rejoined Ethan, but I could tell she was forcing herself to smile. Every few seconds she glanced in my direction, almost as if she was silently asking whether I had made the call. I gave her the slightest nod, and for a brief moment she seemed relieved. Then I noticed something strange. Ethan's best man quietly approached him and whispered something into his ear. Ethan's expression changed for only an instant before he smiled again, excused himself from the guests, and walked toward a private hallway leading to the banquet hall's offices. Without thinking, I followed at a distance, careful not to be seen. The hallway was quieter than the celebration outside, and I could hear faint voices coming from a partially opened door. I recognized Ethan's voice immediately, but the words he spoke made no sense. He sounded anxious, asking someone if everything had been moved, and insisting that no mistakes could happen tonight. Another unfamiliar voice answered that they were running out of time and that someone had become suspicious. My pulse raced. I couldn't understand what they were discussing, but it certainly had nothing to do with an engagement celebration. Before I could hear anything else, footsteps echoed behind me. I quickly stepped away from the door, just as one of the waiters rounded the corner carrying fresh drinks. Pretending I had simply lost my way, I thanked him and walked back toward the ballroom. When I returned, Emma caught my eye again, and this time I noticed tears forming despite her determined smile. At that exact moment, the sound of distant police sirens reached the venue. Most of the guests paid no attention, assuming they were passing by. But Emma quietly exhaled in relief while Ethan slowly turned his head toward the entrance, his confident smile fading for the first time that evening, as though he already knew exactly why those sirens were coming closer. The distant sirens grew louder with every passing second, but inside the banquet hall the music continued, and the guests remained unaware that anything unusual was happening. I forced myself to keep smiling while my mind raced through every possibility. Had Emma discovered something about Ethan? Was someone threatening her? Or had I misunderstood everything? Before I could decide what to do next, Ethan walked toward the center of the room once again, greeting relatives as if he hadn't a single concern in the world. If I hadn't seen the brief look of worry on his face moments earlier, I would have believed he was completely at ease. Emma quietly made her way to my side under the excuse of introducing me to one of Ethan's distant relatives. As soon as we stood close enough, she spoke without moving her lips. Dad, don't let him know I told you anything. Please trust me for a few more minutes. I wanted answers, but I could see she was holding herself together with every ounce of courage she had. I simply nodded and squeezed her hand before she stepped away again. Just then, 2 uniformed police officers entered the reception hall. They did not rush inside or interrupt the celebration. Instead, they calmly spoke with the venue manager near the entrance. Most guests assumed they were responding to a routine call, and the conversations continued. My heart, however, felt as though it would burst from my chest. One officer slowly scanned the room, while the other spoke quietly into a radio. Ethan noticed them almost immediately. His smile returned, but it looked forced now. He excused himself from a group of guests and started walking toward a side exit instead of greeting the officers. That single decision confirmed my growing suspicion that something was terribly wrong. Before he reached the door, one of the officers politely called his name and asked if they could speak with him for a moment. Ethan stopped, turned around with remarkable composure, and laughed as though the request were nothing more than a harmless misunderstanding. Of course, he replied, raising his hand slightly. Is there a problem? The officer explained that they had received a call requesting a welfare check and simply needed to ask a few questions. Ethan agreed without hesitation, but as I watched him, I noticed his right hand slowly slipping into the pocket of his jacket. Emma saw it too. Her face turned pale, and she looked directly at me with eyes filled not only with fear, but with certainty. In that silent moment, I realized she wasn't afraid of what had already happened. She was terrified of what Ethan might do next if he believed the truth was about to come out. The room suddenly felt smaller, as if every wall had closed in around us. I kept my eyes fixed on Ethan's hand as it remained inside his jacket pocket. The police officers maintained calm expressions, speaking to him with steady voices that gave no sign of alarm. Around them, the engagement celebration continued almost normally. A few guests laughed near the dessert table. Children chased balloons across the dance floor. And the band quietly played another song, completely unaware of the tension building only a few feet away. Emma slowly moved closer to my wife, pretending she simply wanted to stand beside her mother. I stepped forward as naturally as I could, hoping that if anything happened, I would be close enough to protect them. Ethan finally removed his hand from his pocket, holding nothing more than his phone. He smiled and apologized, explaining that he thought it had been vibrating. One of the officers politely asked if they could speak somewhere quieter, away from the music. Ethan agreed with surprising confidence and walked with them toward a private lounge, connected to the banquet hall. Before disappearing through the doorway, he glanced at Emma. It wasn't an angry look. It was a look that seemed to ask whether she had remained loyal to him. Emma lowered her eyes without saying a word. The moment the door closed behind them, she grabbed my arm so tightly that I could feel her hands shaking. Barely able to speak, she whispered, "Dad, I found something in his briefcase before the ceremony. I wasn't trying to snoop. He asked me to bring it from his car, because he said it contained the engagement documents. When I opened it, I saw several passports with different names, but the same photograph, stacks of cash wrapped in bank bands, and a folder filled with papers that looked official but didn't seem real. Before I could look closer, he walked back to the car, so I closed it exactly as I found it. When he noticed I looked nervous, he kept asking if I had opened the case. That's when I realized something was terribly wrong. I stared at her in disbelief. Nothing she described matched the man we thought we knew. "Why didn't you tell me immediately?" I asked softly. Tears filled her eyes as she answered, "Because I was afraid he'd notice. And I didn't know who I could trust until I saw you alone." Just then, one of the officers stepped out of the private lounge and looked directly at me. His expression remained calm, but the seriousness in his voice was unmistakable. "Sir," he said quietly, "we need to ask you and your daughter a few questions. There are some details we'd like to verify before anyone else leaves the building." The officer's calm tone reassured me, but the seriousness on his face told me this was no misunderstanding. I nodded for Emma to stay close while I quietly informed my wife that the police needed to ask us a few routine questions. I didn't want to frighten her, or the rest of our family, until we understood what was happening. We followed the officer into the private lounge, where Ethan sat across from another officer. He looked as composed as ever, though I noticed he had stopped smiling. His eyes briefly met Emma's before returning to the table. The officer invited us to sit down and explained that they simply wanted to clarify why an emergency call had been made from the engagement party. I told them exactly what had happened. I admitted that Emma had whispered for me to call 911, without explaining why, and that I trusted her enough to make the call immediately. Emma then gathered every bit of courage she had and described what she had seen inside Ethan's briefcase. She carefully explained that she had found several passports bearing Ethan's photograph, but different names, along with bundles of cash and documents that appeared suspicious. She also admitted she had been too frightened to confront him and believed calling for help was the safest choice. Ethan listened without interrupting. When she finished, he slowly leaned back in his chair and let out a quiet sigh before insisting there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. According to him, the passports were movie props belonging to a close friend who worked in film production, and the cash was intended for a business investment that he hadn't yet deposited. His explanation sounded polished, almost rehearsed, but something about it didn't feel convincing. The officers thanked everyone for remaining cooperative and asked Ethan if he would voluntarily allow them to examine the briefcase to clear up the confusion. He hesitated for the first time that evening. It lasted only a second, but I saw it. Then he smiled again and agreed. One officer accompanied him to retrieve the case from his vehicle, while the other remained with us. The waiting felt endless. Emma held my hand so tightly that neither of us spoke. Nearly 20 minutes later, the officer returned carrying the briefcase. He placed it gently on the table, opened it in front of everyone, and looked inside. To my astonishment, the passports, the bundles of cash, and every suspicious document Emma had described were gone. The briefcase now contained only neatly arranged engagement contracts, family photographs, and a change of clothes. Emma stared at the empty case in complete disbelief. "That's not what I saw," she whispered, her voice trembling. The officer looked at her kindly, then at Ethan, who simply folded his hands and calmly said, "I told you there was nothing to worry about." Yet despite the missing evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had managed to stay one step ahead of all of us, and the real truth was still hiding just beyond our reach. The silence inside the lounge was heavier than any argument could have been. Emma lowered her head, clearly questioning her own memory, but I knew my daughter too well to believe she had imagined everything. She had never been the kind of person to invent stories or create drama, especially on the most important day of her life. The officers remained professional and thanked everyone for cooperating. Since they had found nothing suspicious in the briefcase, they explained that there was no legal reason to take further action at that moment. Before leaving, one of them quietly handed me his card and said, "If anything else concerns you tonight, don't hesitate to call." Those words stayed with me. They suggested that even he wasn't completely convinced the matter was over. As the officers departed, the celebration slowly returned to normal. But the atmosphere had changed for me forever. I watched every movement Ethan made, searching for anything that might explain the fear I had seen in Emma's eyes. He greeted guests, laughed at jokes, and thanked everyone for attending, as though nothing unusual had happened. Yet every now and then, I caught him looking toward the parking lot through the large glass windows, almost as if he were checking whether someone had already left. An hour later, while the photographer gathered the families for another group picture, I noticed a middle-aged man standing alone near the entrance. He wasn't dressed like the other guests, and he seemed more interested in Ethan than in the celebration itself. The moment Ethan saw him, his confident expression faltered for just a second. He excused himself from the photographer and walked outside. My instincts told me to follow, staying out of sight. I stepped onto the terrace and hid behind a stone column, close enough to hear fragments of their conversation. The stranger spoke first in a low, urgent voice. The switch was too close. If she'd looked a few seconds longer, everything would have been exposed. Ethan answered sharply, "I handled it. The police found exactly what they were supposed to find." My heart nearly stopped. Emma had been telling the truth all along. Someone had replaced the contents of the briefcase before the officers examined it. The stranger then handed Ethan a small sealed envelope and warned him that they couldn't afford another mistake, because too many people were already asking questions. Before I could hear anything else, my phone vibrated unexpectedly in my pocket. The sound was faint, but in the quiet night it was enough. Both men turned toward my hiding place at the same time. Ethan's eyes locked onto mine, and for several long seconds neither of us moved. His polite smile disappeared completely, without saying a word. He slipped the envelope into his jacket and began walking slowly in my direction, leaving me to wonder whether I had just uncovered the truth, or placed myself directly in the path of a secret far more dangerous than I had ever imagined. For a brief second, I considered turning around and walking back into the banquet hall, pretending I had seen nothing. But Ethan had already recognized me, and there was no point in hiding it. He approached with the same calm confidence that had impressed everyone from the day I first met him. "Daniel," he said with a friendly smile, "I was just getting some fresh air. Are you enjoying the evening?" His voice was steady, almost reassuring. Yet I could feel the tension beneath every word. The stranger who had handed him the envelope quietly walked toward the parking lot and disappeared into the darkness before I could get a clear look at his face. I forced a smile and replied that I simply needed a moment away from the crowd. Ethan studied me for a second, as if trying to decide how much I had overheard. Then he gently placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "Emma has been under a lot of stress. Weddings can do that to people. Hope you don't let today's misunderstanding ruin such a special occasion." I nodded without revealing anything and watched him return inside. The moment he was out of sight, I hurried to the parking lot hoping to find the mysterious man, but he was gone. Only the sound of a car engine fading into the distance remained. As I walked back toward the entrance, something caught my eye near the curb. A small folded piece of paper lay on the ground, damp from the evening air. I picked it up, looked around to make sure no one was watching, and slipped it into my pocket. Back inside the hall, I waited until I was alone before unfolding it. It wasn't a letter. It was a printed receipt from a storage facility, listing a locker number and a rental date from just 3 days earlier. Scribbled across the back in blue ink were the words, "If anything goes wrong, empty the locker before Monday." My pulse quickened. Whoever had dropped the receipt clearly hadn't meant to lose it. Before I could think further, Emma quietly joined me. I showed her the paper, and the color drained from her face. "I've seen that handwriting before," she whispered. "It's on one of the notes Ethan kept in his home office." We both realized the receipt could be the first real piece of evidence connecting him to whatever he had been hiding. Just then my phone rang. It was the police officer who had given me his card earlier. His voice was calm but urgent. "Mr. Carter," he said, "we've received new information connected to the concerns raised tonight. I need you to do one thing for me. Whatever happens, don't let Ethan know you found anything. We're on our way back, but until we arrive, keep your daughter close and stay where other people can see you." As the call ended, I looked across the ballroom. Ethan was standing at the far end of the room, smiling while talking to guests. But at that exact moment, he slowly lifted his glass toward me, as if he already knew I had just uncovered another piece of the puzzle, the moment. Ethan raised his glass in my direction. An uneasy feeling settled over me. It wasn't a friendly gesture anymore. It felt like a silent message, as though he wanted me to know that no matter what I had discovered, he was still in control. I slipped the storage receipt deeper into my jacket pocket and acted as naturally as possible. Emma remained beside me, pretending to greet relatives while quietly watching Ethan's every move. I leaned close and whispered that the police were returning and had instructed us not to let Ethan know we had found anything. She gave a small nod, but I could see the fear in her eyes slowly being replaced by determination. She had spent the evening trying to protect everyone else, and now I realized how much courage that had taken. A few minutes later, the engagement host announced that dinner was ready, encouraging everyone to take their seats. The large crowd naturally gathered around the decorated tables, making it easier for Emma and me to remain unnoticed. While everyone was distracted, my phone vibrated with a text message from the same officer. It simply read, "We are 5 minutes away. Do not leave the venue." I deleted the message immediately. Across the room, Ethan excused himself once again and quietly headed toward the rear hallway. This time, instead of following him myself, I asked my younger brother Michael to keep an eye on him without confronting him. Michael had served as a security supervisor for many years and knew how to observe without attracting attention. 10 minutes later, Michael returned, looking unusually serious. He told me he had seen Ethan enter a small office near the kitchen, where the banquet manager kept supplies. Through the slightly open door, Michael watched Ethan remove the sealed envelope from his jacket and place it inside. A black backpack that had apparently been hidden behind a cabinet. Before leaving the room, Ethan made a phone call and quietly said, "Everything will be moved tonight. No delays." Those words matched almost exactly what I had overheard earlier. My doubts disappeared completely. Whatever Ethan was involved in had been carefully planned, long before our family gathered for the engagement celebration. Just then, the police officers returned, this time accompanied by 2 plainclothes investigators. They entered through a side entrance to avoid alarming the guests. The officer who had called me met my eyes from across the room and gave a subtle nod. I quietly led him into a private corridor and handed him the storage receipt without letting anyone else notice. He studied it carefully, then looked at me with an expression I will never forget. "Mr. Carter," he said in a low voice, "this receipt connects to an investigation that has been active for several months. We can't discuss the details yet, but your daughter may have uncovered something much bigger than your family realizes." Before I could ask another question, a loud crash echoed from the banquet hall. Glass shattered, guests screamed, and someone shouted that Ethan had disappeared. The sound of breaking glass echoed through the banquet hall, and within seconds, the joyful celebration dissolved into confusion. Guests stood up from their tables. Parents hurried to gather their children, and the musicians stopped playing mid-song. I ran toward the source of the noise with Emma close behind me. One of the large decorative windows near the rear exit had been shattered, leaving broken glass scattered across the floor. Cold evening air rushed into the room, but there was no sign of Ethan. The investigators immediately secured the area and instructed everyone to remain inside while officers searched the grounds surrounding the venue. My wife looked at me with frightened eyes, unable to understand how our daughter's engagement had transformed into what felt like the center of a police investigation. I held her hand and assured her that everything would be explained when it was safe to do so, though the truth was I understood very little myself. The lead investigator quietly asked Emma and me to accompany him to a private conference room. Once the door was closed, he placed the storage receipt on the table beside a folder filled with photographs and documents. Without revealing confidential details, he explained that for several months, authorities had been investigating a sophisticated group suspected of using false identities and fraudulent business records to deceive investors and move money through seemingly legitimate companies. They had struggled to identify every person involved because the organization constantly changed names and locations. According to the investigator, the receipt I had found pointed to a storage locker that might contain evidence capable of confirming several important connections. He believed Ethan could have information related to the investigation, but until that evening, they had never been able to directly link him to it. Emma sat silently, realizing that opening the briefcase had unintentionally uncovered something far more serious than she had imagined. Just then, another officer entered the room with new information. Security cameras showed Ethan leaving through the damaged rear exit and entering a dark-colored vehicle waiting behind the banquet hall. However, the cameras also captured something unexpected. Before getting into the car, Ethan placed the black backpack into the trunk, but the sealed envelope was no longer inside it. The investigator immediately looked at the storage receipt lying on the table. "If we're right," he said, "whatever was inside that envelope may already be in the storage locker." He quickly organized a team to secure the location before anyone else could reach it. As he stood to leave, he turned back toward me and said, "Mr. Carter, tonight began as your daughter's engagement, but it may end with answers that many people have been searching for. For now, your family's safety is our priority." Watching the officers rush out of the room, I realized we had reached the beginning of the end. The next few hours would determine not only whether Ethan was truly the man we believed him to be, but whether my daughter would ever feel safe trusting another person again, writing. As the investigators left for the storage facility, they asked my family to remain inside the banquet hall under police protection. The celebration had long since come to an end. The flowers, music, and decorations that had symbolized hope only ours earlier now felt like reminders of how quickly life could change. Emma sat quietly beside her mother, wrapped in a blanket that one of the venue employees had kindly brought her. She blamed herself for everything that had happened, but I held her hand and reminded her that speaking up had been the bravest decision she could have made. If she had ignored what she saw, we might never have learned the truth. Nearly an hour passed before the lead investigator called me. His voice carried a mixture of relief and determination. They had reached the storage facility before anyone else. Using the receipt as authorization for further investigation, they secured the locker and discovered several boxes containing financial records, electronic storage devices, multiple identification documents, and detailed files connecting several false business identities. Among the documents were records bearing Ethan's photograph under different names, along with correspondence, suggesting that he had concealed his real background for years. The investigator explained that the evidence would require careful examination, but it strongly supported many of the suspicions they had been investigating. Hearing those words filled me with both sadness and gratitude. The young man I had welcomed into my family had never truly been the person he claimed to be. Yet because Emma trusted her instincts, the truth had begun to surface before the wedding could take place. While we were absorbing the news, another officer entered the hall with an update. Ethan's vehicle had been located several miles away, abandoned in a quiet parking area, but he was no longer inside. Authorities believed he had left on foot before officers arrived. A coordinated search was already underway, and nearby agencies had been notified. Despite that uncertainty, the investigators assured us that there was no indication our family was in immediate danger, and additional officers would remain with us until the situation was resolved. Emma leaned against my shoulder and quietly whispered, "Dad, if I hadn't asked you to call 911, I would have spent the rest of my life wondering whether I had ignored the biggest warning of my life." I looked at my daughter and realized how close we had come to a very different future. The engagement had ended, our hearts were broken, and countless questions still remained unanswered. But one thing was certain: the truth was no longer hidden. All that remained was for Ethan to face the consequences of the life he had spent so carefully constructing, and for our family to begin finding the strength to heal together. Writing. The sun had just begun to rise when we finally left the banquet hall. Less than 12 hours earlier, that same building had been filled with music, laughter, and dreams of a joyful future. Now it stood quiet behind us, a reminder that appearances can be deceiving. We returned home together, exhausted but grateful that we were all safe. The following days were some of the most difficult our family had ever faced. Investigators continued examining the evidence recovered from the storage locker, and little by little the truth emerged. Ethan had built an impressive public image, but much of it was based on carefully constructed lies. He had used different identities, hidden parts of his past, and surrounded himself with people who helped maintain that illusion. Although the investigation continued for some time, the evidence collected that night proved to be a turning point. Several people connected to the scheme were identified, and authorities were able to prevent further harm by acting before additional victims became involved. Looking back, I often think about how close our family came to walking into a future we never truly understood. Emma struggled with guilt for weeks, wondering how she had failed to notice the warning signs sooner. I reminded her every day that trust is not weakness. Honest people naturally believe the best in others, and there is no shame in that. What mattered was that when something finally felt wrong, she found the courage to speak up. That single whisper changed everything. My wife and I stood beside her through every difficult conversation, every sleepless night, and every painful memory. Slowly, the fear that had settled over our home gave way to hope again. Friends, relatives, and neighbors surrounded us with kindness, proving that genuine support is far stronger than deception. Months later, the engagement ring that once symbolized heartbreak was quietly placed away, not as a reminder of betrayal, but as a reminder of resilience. Emma eventually returned to her career, her confidence growing stronger with each passing day. She learned to trust her judgment, without allowing one painful experience to define the rest of her life. As for me, I often replay that unforgettable evening in my mind. I can still hear the music, see the smiling faces, and remember the exact moment my daughter leaned close and whispered, "Dad, call 911 right now." Those few words changed the course of our lives forever. They taught me that a parent's greatest responsibility is not simply to celebrate their children's happiest moments, but to stand beside them when they need to be believed the most. If there is one lesson this experience left with me, it is that truth may hide behind the brightest smiles, but courage has a way of bringing it into the light. And because my daughter chose courage over silence, our family lost a celebration. But we gained something far more valuable, the chance to protect our future and begin a new chapter built not on appearances, but on honesty, trust, and the unbreakable bond of family. The end. Hi, my respected viewers, response us that how you like or dislike this video. Give us good comment and follow channel for more. Videos may be live happy, may be live long. Bye.